Dankeschön, Kathleen, for such a beautiful introduction, and to Esther and Alex, and especially Roland, for bringing us all here together. Those of you who are new to the field, I have to start by saying that the description of this entire workshop series is one of the most concise and most inspiring descriptions of the field, and especially identifying what the key problems are, I think, and where the field can go. So thank you all for contributing your work. I'm very aware, as I start off, that I'm in between a rock and a hard place. All of you who will be looking at your watches wondering when we're going to get to wine o'clock and theatrical entertainments to follow will be forgiven. I'm waiting for that too. That's one pressure here. The other pressure is inevitable in a gathering of academics when you are confronted with the obligation to attend a creative event, as we will be later this evening. There are some curmudgeons, or let's just say curmudgeonly thoughts out there wondering, we're all academics, we're here to do academic things, why don't we just do what we're good at and stick to that? So one thing that I hope my talk will do, if nothing else, is to encourage you to combat those curmudgeonly thoughts with the other thought that engaging in creative activity, creative practice, may be the most important thing that we can be doing as animal studies scholars today. So that said, let's get into the talk and get to the wine. Okay, so in Chapter 1 of On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, Charles Darwin compares breeds of plants and animals to dialects of language, noting that the origins of both are difficult to pin down, and they both develop in sometimes unexpected ways. 160 years later, scientists are concerned less with the analogical or metaphorical links between linguistics and species varieties, but more importantly, how the diversity for the future of both hinges on emerging awareness of their vital interdependence. In 2012, the publication of the National Academy of Science in the US, or PNAS for short, released a study that for the first time provides a global map demonstrating the overlap of biological diversity, that's map A above, the diversity of species on the top map, and linguistic diversity, the diversity of languages is map B below. Do you see the correspondence immediately? Noting that the highest rates of convergence occur in areas that aren't just overlapping, but also are biodiversity hotspots and often protected wilderness zones, the authors of the article lead with a warning. Great losses to nature and culture alike are coming unless we develop and implement integrated strategies designed to conserve species and languages in regions rich in both. While sympathetic to this kind of plea, I hear it and I wonder, curmudgeon in me, I guess, are such discoveries really new news? I mean, you don't have to look far in the archives to find abundant evidence that urban industrial pressures on ecosystems result in erasures of species, and along with the erasure of species, a lot of cultures get wiped out as well. So biological extinctions have been irrevocably linked to cultural extinctions for centuries now. As a scholar of literary animal studies and interdisciplinary human-animal studies, and call me out on these terms later, I think we all need to be talking more about the terminology, but from my perspective, I've been obsessed with the questions of when, where, and how people tell stories of not just extinction and genocide, but more precisely their intersections. Familiar examples of what I mean here are Plains Indians and buffalo. I think everyone's seen those photos of the buffalo bones piled high and the skulls with the trains in the background, not uncoincidentally. But as I've started to look for these stories, I've found others of wild sheep and Maghreb tribespeople in the Sahara, Inuit and sled dogs in the Arctic, Pacific Islanders, and whales and other marine species, and the antipodes, just to name a few. What's emerging from this narrative gathering process, that's my method, are a few striking patterns in representing interspecies atrocities that I'd like to outline for you today. And these interspecies atrocities, just to qualify that term, the intimate linkages of particular kinds of animals and often indigenous people in scenes of state-sanctioned mass killings. So these are the patterns that I'm seeing. First, the stories are concerned at many levels with documenting all sorts of human-animal relationships, including domestic, feral, and wild, and maybe more importantly, the porousness of these categories. These stories reveal more porous understandings of life are at stake in these mass killings. Also, another pattern is that to honor the uniqueness of these kinds of relationships, the narratives often experiment with form and forms of representation in ways that stretch the imagination and more. One thing that I'm starting to notice is that they're really deeply using this formal experimentation to launch ideological critiques as well. Another, and maybe even more curious pattern that's emerging as I'm looking for these stories more and more is that since the 1990s, there's been a fast-growing interest in creating and sharing these stories of cross-species intimacies that were once central features of a local sustainable culture and that subsequently became pinpointed as sites of vulnerability to external forces that are bent on their destruction through colonization, or settlement is usually the euphemism. So why creative stories and not just histories? What's important about creativity in this particular kind of context? I need to drink, sorry. Because I'm a proponent of Susan Sontag's theory that works of art don't just say something, they do something, I note that one kind of work that such stories do is the historical work of documenting incredibly complex losses of life along with whole ways of life, so remote as to seem inaccessible to modern industrial minds. So the creative element is kind of deeply involved in the content here. But another kind of work that they do is to articulate the incredible resilience of people and animals, other species, against the pressures of colonization, often in the fragile and protected areas that preserve whatever remains of their populations, even if it's only the traces of their former existence. Taken together, these narratives indicate how much more is at stake in that PNAS study that I started out with than simply quantifying common sense. Instead, as its authors implore, we need to identify how certain cultural systems and practices, namely, they say, those represented by speakers of particular indigenous languages, essentially enable high biodiversity to exist. Rising to this challenge, the narratives that I want to discuss here join in the struggle to work out cultural solutions to what are largely perceived as biological problems. My driving question is, what if narrative works as an integrated conservation strategy and space for maintaining the bearers of unique codes that are at once poetic and genomic? Reflecting and extending the lives of cultures and creatures beyond ordinary biological limits, narrative may be the best and even the only effective means of intervention when species meet on killing fields. At least this is my hypothesis, and it's inspired by Haraway's line, "Stories are much bigger than ideologies, and that is our hope." Just an aside here, often people are reading these books and debating them, talking about them for their content. Haraway's two most recent books, which, yeah, the content is interesting and there's a lot to say. I'm concerned that people are doing that at the expense of engaging in what may be the more radical aspect of them, which is a theory of form, and a theory of narrative in particular. So that's why I see a line like that as jumping right out at me. It's a consistent concern across her work, and something that I think links a lot of what otherwise look like very disparate efforts across animal studies. And then I'm hoping that in an environment like this, especially where we're focusing on cultural and literary animal studies, this can be brought more to the foreground of the discussion. Why is this important? Well, salvation through storytelling would seem to be a great rallying point for literary studies, except for the history of literary criticism, which is one of studied avoidance of the animal. So this is my hobby horse. I could go on and on about this, as I do in animal stories. I'll just restrain myself this evening to one point, or a recent symptom, let's say. The deadlocked discussions of post-colonial scholars interested in literatures of genocide on the one hand, who insist that animalizing the human is a harbinger of human rights atrocities, And on the other hand, there are eco-critical colleagues studying animals in literature who counter that such reasoning illustrates anthropocentrism, if not a more pervasive problem of hierarchical dualism that enables very few to merit consideration as subjects of rights. Those of you familiar with J.M. Coetzee's novels will hear me sounding like Elizabeth Costello right about now. It's okay. I'm an old woman and I don't have a lot of time too, so it's okay if you're making that connection. So that's that second argument that she, as a character, voices as well. As post-colonial eco-critical literary theorists Helen Tiffin and Graham Huggan elaborate, literature itself sometimes creates more problems than it solves for us here. For such discussions are fundamentally compromised by the human, often Western, deployment of animals and the animalistic to destroy or marginalize other human societies. To that I counter, is that all that animals in literature can do? Compromise, destroy, marginalize. But for alternatives, again, literary environments aren't the best places to look. So instead, my work takes me often across disciplines. Studying turn of the 21st century visual artworks that are deeply engaged in these problems of representing animals, art historian Steve Baker identifies the emergence of a contemporary aesthetic of what he terms botched taxidermy. It's a wonderfully appropriate term for the consistency with which visual artists are deliberately producing images and artifacts in which something spectacularly is going wrong with animal life. Applying his theory to some intersections of visual, literary, and other narrative forms, I've identified a broader phenomenon, what I think is a broader phenomenon of formal breakdown, which does not necessarily produce deconstructive dead ends or any other aesthetic failures, although my literary colleagues will disagree. Again, I think that these are not just deconstructive dead ends, again, or aesthetic failures, the narratives that I'm looking at. And what I'm thinking of, for example, is the aesthetic shifts in reading something like George Orwell's Animal Farm, which, used to be taught, especially in the US, where we were really rigidly stuck in formalist criticism, and maybe still are, taught as a Soviet fable. More recently, it's become possible to talk about it as an animal story. Of all things, Animal Farm can be an animal story too. I think a really important aspect of that, though, is the formal shift of people's contact with this narrative, that what started out as a novel, but it has also become a really successful animated film, and more recently an animatronic version of it has been produced. It's mutating through these narrative forms, as many, I think, animal stories do. And that these mutations, I think, call attention to the ways in which perceptions of non-human agency profoundly challenge the primacy of literary subjectivity within the discipline, not the least by offering a means of articulating social actions that exceed the limit, the human individual limit, the human individual subject of rights, especially. So a key way in which narrative forms make animals intelligible as social, aesthetic, sexual, and other agents is by revealing the limits of language alone in representing what anthropologists term intersubjective relations. It's a term that they use to designate a sense of action as irreducibly shared between the two. My favorite example is through fictions of guide dogs, disabled people with guide dogs, that is, authors' narrative experiments with representing human-animal happenings between the two become inextricable from a more profound emergence of what cultural geographer Sarah Watmore calls intercorporeal relations. So this challenge, aesthetically, of representing something that doesn't add up to the action or performance of a single individual body, but is irreducibly extended across bodies, starts to, I think, leverage awareness, acceptance, understanding of far more pervasive systems that go across many bodies. My favorite examples of that are animal husbandry and meat making, but animal husbandry is probably the easier one to think about, breeding practices. And these practices, especially these, widespread ones like husbandry and meat making, traditionally, I guess husbandry more so, are revered at the heart of collective life. So there's a way in which we've forgotten that human-animal relationships can be foundational. At least if you really think through this radical claim that it's not the human subject, but the human-animal relationship that is the foundation of culture, then you see the potential for the profound critique of the Western Enlightenment and its legacies. But I'm slow. It's taken me a long time to figure this out. So yeah, that's what I'm here to talk to you about, how this has come around to dawning on me and moving into the center of my work. Like Akira Lippert, Nicole Shukin, and others, through my last book project, I was kind of haunted by citations without interpretations of John Berger's now infamous claim that animals are disappearing in modernity. You can't throw a rock at a pile of animal studies book and not hit that quote somewhere in there. It's often cited, but it's not often elaborated. And one thing that disturbs me personally about that is in the line, animals are disappearing in modernity. The key word there for me is disappearing. It's a gerund, it's a process. It's not a foregone conclusion. So to emphasize the erasure of animal life as a process, I zeroed in on forms of human-animal relationships early in my career that did not exist before the 20th century, again, like assistance animals, or ones that persist but are profoundly altered by modern technological interventions. Think about pet keeping and how much spay-neuter has changed the ways that we live with traditional pets. An unintended consequence of this decision, anybody who's going to review animal studies, start taking notes. I'll do your work for you right now of critiquing myself. An unintended consequence is that I added to a much bigger problem in animal studies, namely our over-representing European American urban industrial life, and that comes at the expense of arguably the most vulnerable and important populations of peoples and animals in the world today. It's not that I don't care or didn't care about biocultural diversity, it's just that I did not know then yet what to do with the resurgence of the disappearing stories that's happening all around us. So, biocultural narrative. Thinking through the combined threats of biological and cultural extinction begins to help me to make sense of how certain contemporary stories have been shadowing my research all along, compelling me to teach these incredibly difficult texts. I try not to cry in the classroom. Can't promise you I won't cry here as I talk about some of these things. They're very difficult. So it compelled me to teach them, which of course led me to write about them, produce a string of essays, without knowing until now, until I was preparing to come here actually, that there is a bigger argument holding them together. Playing to my strengths, I'll walk you through some of the literary examples, and along the way mentioning examples from film, web-based media, installation art, and other narrative forms that I hope to complement and extend these arguments with. Mostly what I want to do is give you some case studies to think through my three main concerns here. First and foremost, about the historicity of these stories, histories of extinction and genocide, or in other words, why these particular incidents become so compelling to narrate from the 1990s forward. Secondly, how they use highly culturally specific human-animal relationships to move into formal experiment and from there towards ideological critique. Third major question here is the notion that such narration can avoid the trap of re-victimization. Maybe that's the toughest point to argue here. That is that these stories are never simply exploiting the pain and death of others so much as they operate as unique and positive interventions. They'll make you cry, but they do other stuff too. So this is the point where I turn and start talking through some examples here. Perhaps because I live in and am of North America, this project is haunted peculiarly by the century-long and longer genocide known as the American Indian Wars. So pervasive is the perversely romanticized image of the Indian as the last of a dying breed that it is not surprising that animal agents have only recently entered into Native American fiction in any significant way. Again, that post-colonial literary problem is really obvious in Native American literature. Ahead of the curve in many ways, Chickasaw novelist Linda Hogan offers some pretty stunning examples that turn the tide in this more positive direction, I think. But they're also stunning examples of how the Western colonial terms of the past are being reworked through representations of human-animal relationships at the brink. Her last two novels recreate actual high-profile incidents from recent decades in which members of native tribes have killed members of highly endangered animal species deliberately, on purpose. True stories. None of this is easy material, as I told you, not for a novelist or a critic, and certainly not for a teacher or a student. Hogan's 1998 novel Power focuses on a Native American woman accused of killing a severely endangered Florida panther, and it's loosely based on a 1983 incident in which a Seminole man named James Billy, that's him on the left, was tried in an American federal court for having killed one of these big cats who have been rendered almost extinct. There's estimated to be 100 of them left in their native Florida swamps. Partly the pressure on them is development, the sprawling suburb that is Florida, and agriculture as well. Mostly they're being killed right now by cars. But this native guy, Seminole man, was put on trial for shooting and killing one. Although James Billy's leadership role as a sometime Seminole tribal chairman proved crucial to his defense, Billy himself was also an alligator wrestler, a songwriter, a Vietnam veteran, in Hogan's words elsewhere, a very complicated man. Drawn out over 4 years, the trial concluded with Billy's acquittal on the grounds that the killing represented his exercise of religious freedom. The acquittal was largely seen as a victory for tribal sovereignty over environmental regulation, while U.S. news media reduced the story to even more simplistic terms, casting it as a case of native rights trumping animal rights. You see how the language of rights isn't helpful here. So, Hogan to the rescue. To restore the shared history of suffering and loss, the novel's version of the story stages 2 more scenes of judgment that question the terms of Billy's conviction. Tribal elders conduct a separate trial in which, as a member of the Panther clan, the killer must be punished with banishment for sororicide for killing Sisa, the panther, her sister. But Sisa is also an animal god who returns at the end of the novel to offer a final and most severe judgment. Sisa sees the blame as more broadly distributed, shared because humans have broken their covenant with the animals, their original word, their own sacred law, and thereby doom everyone. The novel thus brackets off the question of whether the panther was sacrificed, as in the tribal creation myth, from which act followed the renewal of cross-species relations and environs alike, where the panther and the people became siblings to each other. That's one possibility for what happens in the novel, or whether the panther is simply killed as the consummate act of degradation, signaling the end of indigenous and species history alike. Instead, this three-way trial triangulation allows the central query to become, what is the tribeswoman's crime of killing her non-human sister compared with the crimes that condemn all to extinction? Where humans can only assign or absolve one from blame, the animal god sees her female cross-species relatives, and not just the killer, but the killer's niece, who serves as the witness to the crime, and also she sees amanuensis in the story, and the victim herself, who is both god and animal, as all 3 of them the sacrifice in this place that has grown small with rusty nails. Do I have this here? Yes. All 3 the sacrifice in this place that has grown small with rusty nails and oil drums in the shadow of buildings. Though fanciful, the Florida panther as animal god's vision stakes out a crucial strategy through which Hogan's novel insists on the historicity of any ethical system and the necessity of moving beyond the limiting terms of human subjectivity for taking up deeply shared responsibilities. Although more troubled in a lot of ways, her most recent novel, People of the Whale, likewise reenacts the killing of another member of a highly endangered species, this time a young gray whale, by members of the Pacific Northwest McHugh tribe, who in 1999 did this, and not only did this, but it's an incident that, although it was undertaken in the name of tribal renewal, revitalization, sovereignty, independence, sounds like all good things, it raised way more controversy when it emerged that prior arrangements were made to sell the meat to Japanese buyers. At the heart of Hogan's retelling of the story, another Native American Vietnam War veteran is more explicitly drawn, and much of the novel is told by his half-Vietnamese tribal daughter. She's Hmong, I think, but not quite. Hogan's pretty deliberately sketchy about naming tribes or creating new ones. Whom this central guy, who in many ways is sympathetic, had abandoned. So another very complex man, a contemporary Native man, is central to this story. And because we're taken to Vietnam, he's related to a Vietnamese tribal family, it's hard to miss the global indigenous politics in this story. They're latent, maybe, in power. Here they're right in your face. And again, shadowy elders and animal gods, all of whom may or may not be real, populate spaces within the narrative in ways that enable the colonizer-victim dichotomy to open out to third-way options, from which it becomes possible to speak of deeper obligations, as well as to critique the colonization of not simply people and landscapes, but also of historical time. These insertions of lost ancestors, animals, and animist gods in animal forms into representations of current events becomes an important way, I think, in which Hogan invokes the native present as a way to resurrect a native past and to imagine a native future. As another North American Indian novelist and professor, Thomas King, puts it, to create, in words as it were, a native universe as an alternative to the exterminationist history in which their stories have otherwise become stuck in the past. Intriguingly, it's also a strategy that finds popular audiences, one that legendary Japanese anime director-writer Hayao Miyazaki uses in Princess Mononoke, which I'm assuming people have seen, right? Yeah. If you haven't, go see it. You'll cry, but it's worth it. I have a hard time teaching it because I cry a lot during it, but that's just me. So what's really cool in researching that film is that it wasn't simply a blockbuster when it was released, but that release date coincided with a landmark decision in the Japanese federal courts that for the first time recognized Utari people. Don't call them Ainu, they don't want to be called that. Utari people, who are the last native peoples of Japan, mostly located in the North Island of Hokkaido, for the first time in history recognized them as having any kind of rights, it was to stop a dam being put up, and it acknowledged that they had some kind of prior claim on the landscape. That, if you know Princess Mononoke, it's really interesting then that this animal gods show up in a way that is speaking to something that's happening in the historical moment. And of course, vanished people, the Amishi people, again, another native group, but one who's long gone. And before them, the Jomon people are clearly referenced by the characters in this film. So it's a strategy that works to, I think, talk a lot about not just extinct animals, but also the extinguishment of cultures. The strategy is central as well to the work of a North African tribal writer who even more explicitly focuses on the contemporary pressures on traditionally nomadic human-animal life. Literary critics, again, here's a problem with my peeps. Literary critics tend to dismiss the return of traditional animist figures and events as magical realist elements, echoing earlier generations' praises of so-called primitive forms like legends and folk tales. And to be fair, it's not just a problem for literary analysis. Addressing the parallel metaphor model problem with anthropology, René Willerslev suggests a solution by reframing animism in terms of a kind of indigenous metaphysics that deeply unsettles ontological certainties. Likewise, to engage in a critical dialogue concerning theories of knowledge, people with animals and animal gods are depicted in terms familiar to their shared desert environments in the fictions of Ibrahim Al-Koni. And this is just a small selection. He's published over 80 books, but these are the ones that I've zeroed in on. He's the most widely translated Arabic novelist alive today. But he's also born in southeastern Libya into the nomadic matriarchal Tuareg tribe, whose history is a trail of tears, brought to the brink by the Italian fascists' horrific acts of genocide in the early 20th century in between world wars. Like Hogan, Al-Koni does not detail these incidents in his fictions, but rather references them in creative ways that delineate the larger forces linking the erasure of the modern genocidal history of the Tuareg. They're the victims of it, not the perpetrators, just to clarify. Linking that history to the extermination of Saharan animal life. Here's a representative moment in one of the novels, and one that invokes the metamorphosis of a captive man into the kind of large-horned wild mountain sheep known as mouflon, or in the local dialects, as Al-Koni prefers, a wadan. The event was something the people of the oasis constantly recounted, around which they wove legends. The young men told them how they'd witnessed a man break loose from his captivity and change into a wadan, then run off toward the mountains, bounding over the rocks like the wind, heedless of the bullets flying all around him. Had anyone ever seen a man transformed into a wadan? Had anyone ever seen a person escape the Italians' guns, running on till he vanished into the darkness of the mountains? The wise oasis Sufis were convinced, one and all, that this man was a saint of God. That evening they went to the Sufi mosque and celebrated, filled with joy that the divine spirit should come to dwell in a wretched creature of this world. Relayed through so many interpreters, young men, wise oasis Sufis, and other people of the oasis, as in the Arabic Hadith tradition, what exactly happens here is difficult to say. But in this telling, the event brings into sharp focus a threat to much more than an individual's life. And this is just to give you a sense of the remoteness of the people. That's the Tuareg's territory in the inner Sahara. They don't really travel much in the outer Sahara. And that version of the book cover gives you a sense of why they're called the Blue Men. It's a matriarchal tribe, and so their adaptation or interpretation of Islam, men are veiled as well they should be. And you can sort of see in that version too, the reflection of the camel in the man's eye tells you that it's a love story between a man and a camel. It's okay, it's platonic. But yeah, so these are the Tuareg. These are the folks we're talking about. So, again, to go back to that quote, the man in question has arrived at this scene as destitute, a nomadic herdsman who has lost all of his animals to an extreme drought, and in seeking refuge at the oasis, he inadvertently becomes a witness to a far greater tragedy. The Italians' guns obliquely refer to what is perhaps the least known and most horrific genocide of the 20th century, that is, the Italian colonial authorities' confinement from 1929 to 1933 of what is estimated to be over 100,000 nomadic North African tribal peoples. The archives are still closed, actually, so no one knows the sheer numbers just yet, but this is coming out in recent research. So they strung barbed wire around nomadic people and their animals, and then the people starved to death after their animals starved to death. It was horrific. I mean, people watched their animals die, knowing full well what was going to happen to them next. So driven by hunger into this zone, into his first and last encounter with the oasis people, this character, at a time and place in which countless others like him died in detainment, the fictional herdsman's capture by colonial military forces seems tantamount to a death sentence, from which he is delivered by his fantastic transformation into a wadan. As the oldest animal in the Sahara and one revered for its totemic noble significance in pre-Islamic Berber North Africa, which of course includes ancient tribespeople like the Tuareg, and subsequently rendered extinct in parts of Europe as early as the 20th century, the Wadan seems a fitting metaphor for the Maghribian nomad fleeing colonial European forces. But the novel envisions a far more complex relation between the two. Although the animal that the herder appears to become in order to escape certain doom is one he himself has known all his life in the open Sahara, the Wadan erupts as an extremely rare spectacle to the oasis people witnessing the transfiguration in this scene. Not exactly innocent bystanders, the rest of the novel reveals that they too have used the Italians' guns only to hunt this kind of animal, along with so many other wild species of gazelle and other animals, to the brink of oblivion. Amid a story in which the herdsman comes to believe that he was born to protect the severely endangered species, alongside the ancient carvings and cave paintings at Tassili, which is another UNESCO World Heritage Site. I love that connection about this talk and where we are right now. I can say more about that later too, this Tassili scene and why it turns up in all of these novels. In this story, the herdsman, again, is trying to protect the species, and this place that across millennia is a testament to the human-animal relationship. In the end, he gets slaughtered in place of the animal when he refuses to show hunters where to find it. So Alconi introduces a curious flight line with this momentary image of the human-animal fleeing the scene of historic mass killings. Under what conditions is such a transformation seen or rendered visible at all? And to what exactly does a person escape in the act of becoming an animal? Comparing several similar moments across Alconi's fiction, in one of these essays that I've already published, I've outlined a pattern in which humans and animals together evoke ancient animist belief systems in order to develop a uniquely compelling and contemporary critical perspective on state-sanctioned slaughter. In the immediate conversion of the scene to oral history around which they wove legends, remember, the contributions to grassroots social justice movements like the Arab Spring, and with Miyazaki's film, Utari landscape claims, even the insistence on local names for the animals who are mainstays of nomadic people's everyday lives, I see many important, if also unlikely, connections to a social justice project focused on Kimit, or Inuit sled dogs. Again, the only semi-feral working animal that I know of, and stop for a minute, pause. Semi-feral working animal, what can that possibly mean? It means that traditionally for half the year, dogs were kept in harness, and then for half the year left to fend for themselves. They'd still hang around people, they'd come back, go into work, but these, as you might imagine, are really tough dogs to work with, who know what it's like to be wild and can take off into the wilderness if they feel like it, and sometimes do, yes. So a really, really amazing relationship. This Kikatani Truth Commission is devoted to documenting the history of their demise in the eastern Canadian Arctic through a series of incidents popularly known as the Mountie Sled Dog Massacre. But they use the term Kimitsitoknik, which means the mass killing of the dogs. This is part of the project that I've most recently drafted, so I'll just say that it was inspired by the controversy over the lack of Canadian national level responsibility being taken for the devastation of Inuit culture through forced relocations, removal of children to residential schools, and other heinous policies in the second half of the 20th century, really from the 1950s through the 1970s, so that this happened during my lifetime makes it peculiarly compelling. Starting in the 1990s, protests inspired a rare Indigenous-led social justice project called the Kikatani Truth Commission eventually. And their purpose was to contrast the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's government-ordered self-study. The Mountie Sled Dog Massacre, they were charged with finding any evidence within their own archives that this actually happened and that the Canadian government was responsible for the devastation of Inuit through the destruction of their dogs. Imagine this. They decided they were not guilty. Yeah, and part of the problem with the process that they went through in absolving themselves from any responsibility for this happening was that the total number of Inuit that they interviewed as part of this self-study was 8. The number 8. And so the Qikiqtani Truth Commission became galvanized around collecting stories from elders and their immediate relatives, and they came back with over 300. Indicating quite clearly that, yes, indeed, Mounties were involved in the killing of dogs. But what emerged through this process is something that is pretty amazing. If you Google Qikiqtani Truth Commission, a website will turn up that's under construction that is making these narratives available to primarily the community. It's a community memory project. But what also is unique about it is that it is an Indigenous-led social truth commission. And note that it's not a Truth and Reconciliation Commission either. Reconciliation is not necessarily part of the project. Just getting this on record, getting these stories into history, stories that were officially denied, giving them a new life, and doing it through this multivocal, polyvocal, narrative, web-based, networked narrative form, I think is again more evidence that these kinds of stories need formal experimentation. The existing structures of stories, the existing expectations that stories are what one person tells about their own perspective is entirely different. It just doesn't rise to what's needed in this circumstance, in these situations. I could tell you a whole lot about Inuit sled dogs because that just, I talk about dogs too much anyhow, but I think this is utterly a fascinating portion of it, that it's gone from historical, this project is taking me from historical stories through fiction and back into history in the making, is what makes it really fun and really compelling. But by way of closing, I'll say that what I think this all adds up to in terms of a focus on the present around the 21st century, around the turn of the 21st century, can also be elaborated through affect theory in a surprising way, particularly the work of Lauren Berlant, who in a very different argument about U.S. political culture and aesthetics identifies the 1990s as a turning point away from optimism about structural transformation. Among the many symptomatic sites of dissolving assurances that she identifies is included a sense of, in her words, the dissolving assurances around lively, durable intimacy. From this perspective, I wonder about the multiple linkages. I wonder about the multiple linkages of crumbling families, tribes, human-animal relationships, ecosystems, and all of their implications for human cultures and animal species outside the protected zones that, to return to my beginning, appear to be the final frontier of diversity on a global scale, not to mention some seriously important cross-species intimacies at local levels. What I want to leave you wondering, along with me and Berlant, is how the aesthetics that might be identified through this particular pattern of narrating human-animal relations in the end, as in Berlant's terms, provides metrics for understanding how we pace and space our encounters. She says with things, but I'm saying with non-human beings, how we manage the too closeness of the world and also the desire to have an impact on it that has some relation to its impact on us. Ordinarily conceived as relics of the past, those subjected to biocultural extinctions are returning in our time through creative approaches to contemporary narrative, reasserting their place within theories of knowledge that are critical for our shared futures with other life forms. While reveling in the growing celebrations of companion species relations, and I forgot to mention bees. Yes, there's a lot more to say about honeybees and installation art. Ask me about that. I'll go on and on. I think companion species relations are cool. I'm down with that, right? But I grow increasingly aware of the much more difficult but necessary and maybe urgent work of articulating losses shared at the level of populations and across species lines. Again, it's important to note that these stories are being told now as never before, both in terms of quality, nothing else. I hope to have got you inspired about the idea that these stories are growing around us in numbers, but they're also changing in terms of quality. For these stories of multi-species mass killings use formal innovation never simply to illustrate cases where cultures are killed along with the biological agents that supported them. These narratives multiply, contain, and impart knowledges that persist despite failures to conserve companionate lifeways of species, and so surprisingly can serve as exemplars of that hopeful place where stories exceed ideologies. Thank you for my patience, for your patience with my tired work.